Hey, I'm Tim Hines, and I'm talking about Agile tactics for product marketing. So back in my first product marketing job almost 8 years ago, my company was targeting software development teams who were going through Agile transformations or perhaps who had just gone through an Agile transformation. And through that, I was attending a lot of conferences, one of which was the Agile Alliance conference every year, where I was meeting a lot of Agile coaches and some company IT executives who were looking for ways that they can go Agile so that they could increase output with the limited resources that they had. And then about a year or two ago, I started seeing the same coaches talking about Agile marketing transformations, and I knew what question was coming next. Should product marketers go Agile so that they can do more things in less time with fewer resources? And my response to this was sort of, that's not how this works. That's not how any of this works, right? I mean, Agile isn't really going to be great if you're looking for a better, faster, cheaper way to do things. And you're going to be really disappointed with it, and your management team is going to be really disappointed with it if you go in with those sort of expectations. Now, for product marketing, what I've found is that Agile can be particularly good at helping you to answer questions that your management team may have of you or may have or other internal teams may have for you that you get on a pretty regular basis, that through doing some Agile practices, using some of the tactics that I'm going to talk about, you'll be able to answer these questions pretty easily, and it will help, sort of get in front of a lot of these questions, so people won't come to you as often with these questions. So some of them are, what are you working on? When will we have X? Do we have anything for Y? Can you make something for Y then? Why are you always saying no to the things I asked for? Why didn't you complete the things you put on the annual plan a year ago? Hey, looks like you did way more than the plan for this year. Were you sandbagging it? Now, a lot of these questions are questions that I've personally received, or I've talked to other product marketers who've received these questions from the sales team, some of my managers, some people from other internal teams, some people within the marketing team that I've worked on. And it's difficult because as product marketers, we tend to get a lot of requests from a lot of different directions. We work closely with the product team, we work closely with the sales team, we work closely with the marketing team, and we are asked to do a lot of things, and sometimes we're sort of seen as the people who are always saying no, or we end up looking like the people who do a lot of things reactively and aren't completing the original plan that we had at the time. So particularly with this question, you end up sort of trying to make a thinner plan for the year and fill it in because you know you're going to get requests over the year with other things, so that you make sure you get everything done that was on your original plan for the year, but you also get the things done that are being asked of you throughout the year. So it's a little bit of getting out in front of it. But as far as Agile goes with this, it's really not about finding specific tactics that are going to be able to make you Agile. The thing that you sort of have to understand before you start using any of the tactics, before you start doing any of the practices, is that Agile is really more sets, right? So to understand this better, I'm going to have to give you a little bit of history about where Agile started. So back in February 2001 in Snowbird, Utah, representatives from Scrum, Extreme Programming, and a slew of other software development frameworks that were born out of the pain of a Dilbert-esque and office space-like environment and processes that were prevalent at the time, They basically convened and produced what was called the Manifesto for Agile Software Development. Now, you can read more about this meeting and some of the other aspects of the Agile Manifesto at agilemanifesto.org. It's basically 4 tenets and 12 principles that can be summed up as follows. 1. People are most important, so treat them that way. There's a lot of talk about resources, and in the 90s especially, it was extremely popular to talk about people as being resources and asking to throw more resources at this or throw more resources at that, and what they were talking about clearly were people at this. And what they were reacting to at the time was basically, hey, those resources have names, they're people, they have families, they go home at night and do different things that aren't related to work. So treating people like people is the top of the list for the original producers of the Agile Manifesto. 2. We can't know the future, so adjust plans when new information justifies it. Now, this is really a reaction to the traditional waterfall development processes that were very popular at the time, where you'd come out with a spec for a product and you'd have a list of features that would be ready to be developed that would take 3 years to produce, and everything would flow down from spec to design to code to test to deployment, and never really go back and iterate throughout that process. And it would take a long time to do that, and customer needs might change over that time, and it would sort of stick to that same plan throughout it. I mean, you can think of this as being sort of the Microsoft Office release process that used to occur before Office 365, for example. 3. Delivering something that provides value now is better than delivering something that may be more valuable later. So this is really tied back to number 2, where working on something where you're able to deliver value in a short period of time to a customer is better than being able to make sure that you've got this perfect piece of software that may deliver more value later down the line. But as mentioned earlier, if customer needs change throughout that, you may have a bunch of code that you worked on that's no longer relevant because customer needs have changed, and maybe the market's changed and nobody wants to do that anymore. Maybe you've got a competitor who came out during that time and swept the entire market with what you were working on, and now you're 2-3 years late to the party. And that's it, really. I mean, those 3 things are what you need in order to have this agile mindset. And, if you're doing those 3 things, then really you're already agile. And congratulations to those of you finding out just now that you can say you're agile. You can go ahead and put that on your LinkedIn profile and your resume or whatever else you want to tag that to. But I know some of you are probably, what about scrums, sprints, stand-ups, retros, user stories, and all that other agile stuff that you hear about? Well, basically, it's kind of like this. Scrum, Kanban, XP, all of those things, they're frameworks for how to work with an agile mindset, but they don't define what agile is. It's really those 3 beliefs that I talked about previously, that if you're working in that way, if you're doing things that are consistent with that, then you can go ahead and say that you're agile. But you can do that without scrums, you can do that without sprints, retros, user stories, or any of that other stuff. Now, as marketers, it's important to know that all of these frameworks aren't even a one-size-fits-all for software development. A lot of the processes like Scrum and XP, for example, were pretty good for web-based software that's pretty easy to deploy, SaaS software, easy to deploy. It's easy to do those things in 2-week iterations and come out with something and deploy it, and all of your users would get it at the same time because it's a web app. So um, you control the environment where they're doing that to. Now, a lot of these frameworks, a lot of these practices would have to be adjusted to work with other types of software development teams. For example, you've got teams who are deploying to desktop users where they have to go and download the latest version of your software, or embedded software development teams who are working on firmware on devices where you have to download firmware updates to those, and people don't really like doing that too often, so it doesn't work extremely well on highly frequent iterations. And I mean, think about government software compliance organizations where you've got to justify the reason for why you're upgrading to the latest version of a particular tool that you're using, and fill out several forms in order to even allow that to happen. So a lot of these teams have had to take certain aspects of these frameworks, of some of these practices, and adjust them in order to work with the processes and the practices that they have to comply with outside of just the standard software development, as it were. So overall, what you should do is pick what works for you, your team, and your organization. Every product and marketing organization is different, so don't try to force your team to follow a strict framework. And if you start to do a particular practice, you start to practice sprints or user stories, and you're finding it's not working for your team's not enjoying it, you find that they're avoiding doing it because they don't think it works with what you're doing, stop doing it. It's not going to be useful for you. It's not going to be useful for your team. So let's move on to the Agile tactics that I came here to talk about in the first place. Now, these are going to be Agile tactics that I found useful. These are going to be some adaptations that I've done from Scrum, from Kanban, from a few different practices to be able to adapt them to have to be useful to a marketing team and be useful to a product marketing team specifically. And I basically grouped them into 3 categories of tactics. And the first one is team documents. Now, I've got a few different, and the first one we're going to start with is team values. So what you should do to start off, before you do anything, before you adopt any other practices, write down as a team, sit down in a conference room, get on a conference call if you're remote, everyone talk about what you think is important for the team itself. Now, here's a list of some of the ones that I came up with on a previous team with the rest of my team. Things like outcomes over outputs, methodical responses to change over hasty reactions, and so on. A lot of these are really specific to marketing in general. Things like quality leads over quantity of leads, quality content over quantity of content, and what this list of team values does is anytime you need to make a decision about pretty much anything on your team, you can go back and look and see if it's consistent with your values. It's the same as any sort of any list of company values. If you have a list of company values that your company really adheres to, and doesn't just pay lip service to them, go ahead and use those by all means. Use those as a starting point, and then build off of there with anything else that's specifically useful for your team. in order for them to make decisions about what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. The next thing we have here, the team working agreement. Now, this is more akin to sort of one of the development frameworks that I was talking about. So this document is really going to describe how you do things. It's going to be more along the line of what you're doing throughout the week, throughout the sprint, and what you're doing on a regular basis. So the values, again, more how, this more what. So you're having things like, for us, it was really important for us to be able to make sure that everything we do went onto a Trello board. So this first one here, visualize your work. If it's not in Trello, it doesn't exist. That was really important to us. It's part of the transparency value that we had on our team value sheet. And so this is basically coming up with a list of the way that the team works together. And you want everyone to agree to this, and preferably once you've done that, once you've worked together as a team and come up with the way that you want to do things as a team, have everyone sign it. That way you can go back and show someone if they've, if they're not doing things that we agreed on as a team, go back and say, well, look, we all signed this document. This is the way that we said we were going to work. If we don't agree with that, we should discuss it, and we can take things off of this list if we need to. We can amend this working agreement. It's a living, breathing document, but everyone should be on board with what's listed here before you decide to before you put everything into practice. Next thing we have here is the value effort estimation scoring. So basically what we've got here is the scoring system for how you would estimate the value and effort for any projects you're going to be putting on your board. So if you have a board, if you're listing all of the projects that you're working on there, you want to be able to determine which ones are going to be more valuable and for the effort that they're actually worth. So taking the value and comparing it to the effort, making sure that you've got something that is worth the amount of effort that you're putting into it. So here I've got the effort basically listed as a pretty solid method. It's minutes, hours, days, weeks, months to be able to figure that out. Now it can fit anywhere within those, and we sort of just assign these numbers to it. This is what normal development teams would use story points for, but one thing that's really important, at least for us as a team, we found was to be able to assign value scores to it. So the value is a little bit more ambiguous than the effort score, a little bit harder to define. So I've got some bullet points in here as to how we were defining what we considered to be a certain level of value. And, it can be things like number of leads that a particular project brings in, or the amount of money it saves the company, or the increase in efficiency of conversion rates, or anything like that you can measure. But you basically want to compare it to other projects that you've done in the past over time and sort of adjust these scores based on that. So the next thing here is definitions. So these are things that you're really going to want to define. You're going to need some definitions to be able to figure out, first of all, what you're going to say no to, when a project is ready to be worked on and to be put into a prioritized backlog for the team, and to be able to define when a project is done. So the first one here, definition of no, this is one that we came up with that we thought was really important for us to be able to explain to people within the organization, other internal teams, sales teams, partners teams, product teams in some cases, whenever they request something, that we either we basically have determined that the value to effort ratio is too low for us to work on that project compared to some of the other projects that we have in the backlog, or that there aren't clearly defined requirements or commitment from the stakeholder who requested it, or it doesn't fit with our own team values or with the company values, or if we know that there's a hard deadline for a particular project that we're just not going to be able to do a great job at doing that. So defining what that is for your team when you say no and why you say no to someone is really important, and most importantly is to be able to explain that to other people within the organization as to why you're saying no. So back to one of those questions that I posed at the beginning of the presentation, why do you keep saying no to all the things I ask? Here's the reason. It's right here. You can come up with a standard definition for it. Everybody says it's not you, it's the list of bullets that we have here. These are the things that we don't do. And if you come up with something that fits this, clearly we can add it to the backlog and start to work on it. Definition of ready is also really important. It's basically what you define as being the things you need to start working on a project. So for us, it was if we were putting a card onto our Trello board, we needed a title for it. We needed to know who the requester was. We needed to know who the audience was for the particular project, a short description of the project, and we need to be able to run it through the definition of no that we had. And then we do a number of other things like assess it with a value effort score and make sure that whoever owned that functional area of the team, whether it be demand gen or messaging or design or whoever it was present and agreed that the card didn't meet the definition of no for what their particular area was. This last one here is really important whenever you get to a project that you want to cross off your list and say it's done, is defining what's actually meant by done. So for us, it was the value of the project is delivered, so whoever's the intended audience receives the value of it. The scope of the card's completed. Content is live if it's content. The leads are uploaded if it's a campaign or demand generation program. Announcements have been sent out, like if it's an internal sales tool that we're creating, making sure that the announcements for that has gone out to our sales team. So these can all be really, really useful for your team to define. That way you're all on the same page about everything that you do. So when you say something is done, everyone on the team knows what that means by done. And it saves a lot of arguments, saves a lot of unnecessary friction. Next category of tactics I'm going to talk about is the first one is the sprint planning meeting. So the sprint planning meeting is basically the meeting that you would do at the beginning of each iteration, at the beginning of each sprint, if you're doing if you're using a process where you're going to use sprints or iterations. We basically found that the one that worked the best for us as a marketing team was to do them in about 1 week. So we'd start every sprint planning meeting on a Monday morning. We define what we're going to do for that week. We pull anything new from the backlog there. If there's anything that we're not working on, we move that out of the in progress for the week, and we basically clean up our board a little bit, define what we're going to be working on, and clearly communicate to the other team members if we need them on any project before we actually start working on that project for that week. For example, if I'm going to be working on a web page, if I'm going to be working on the copy for a web page, I want to make sure that our designer is going to be able to help me out with the graphics or help me out with putting things up onto the web page later that week if there's time to do that, and make sure that the scope of it's understood there so that there are no surprises throughout the week. And the other thing to do there is to basically say, okay, these are the things we're doing this week, and we're not going to do anything else besides these things this week. If something comes up, we can do it next week. And usually a week is a pretty good amount of time to, if in case you get any requests throughout the week and somebody asks you to do something, you can always say, no, I don't really have time to do it this week. I've got all of these other projects I'm working on, but I can put it into the backlog and make it prioritized top of the list for next week, and we can start working on it next week. And I found that that works pretty well for most people. Most people will say that's a reasonable amount of time for them. You'll occasionally get some things that are extremely urgent, have to be done immediately, but it's also important, again, to adapt your process to be able to fit that. So I'll talk a little bit about that part. Another thing here is our backlog grooming meeting. So this is a meeting that we basically do once per week. We do it at the end of the sprint, not the very end of the sprint. It's basically Friday mornings for us. We go through things that have been added to the backlog, the requests that have come in, things that have met our definition of ready and are going to be added. Anything that's put into the backlog at that point goes through and is prioritized with the other items that are already in the backlog, so that you can, if there's, again, like a request that came up the week before or during the current week, and you need to move that one all the way to the top, it's more important than the other ones that are already in the backlog, then you can do that during the backlog grooming meeting. And the purpose of this is basically to have that prioritized list so that when you go into your sprint planning meeting, you can just pick the ones right off the top, because those are the most important ones. Save a lot of time on Monday morning to be able to go through that and easily get the ones that you know are going to be most important to work on that week. Next one we have here is retrospectives. And retrospectives is really one of my favorite ones. It's something I think that any team who's doing anything should do on a regular basis. And it's basically looking back at what you've been doing, how you've been working, and talking about the things that you should stop doing. If there are things that the team thinks are unproductive, things that you should start doing, that, you know, if there's a better way to do something, if there's a thing that needs to be done, add that to the start doing list. And things that you should keep doing. For example, maybe you did something really well, or you've got someone on the team who did something great and the team reacted in a certain way, and you'd like them to continue to do that. You want to make sure that you recognize those sorts of things. So it's a little bit of praising the team within this, but also discussing the things that need to change as a team. And we do this about every other sprint. So for us, it's once every 2 weeks. And then the things that we've added to that, we either will add an item to our board to start working on them, if there's something that requires that, or we'll go back and amend our team working agreement to reflect what happened during the meeting. So if there were things that we wanted to stop doing that were on the working agreement, we'll strike those from there. If there are things that we want to start doing, we'll add those to it. Or if there are things that we want to keep doing, just emphasize that for it. Next one here is daily stand-ups. Now, I will admit, we don't do daily stand-ups because it doesn't really fit for what we do as a team. And the reason for that is that there's not a lot of crossover on the team that I'm working on currently, and some of the teams I've worked on in the past. We have done daily stand-ups. It really just depends on your team. And the reason for that is because what you do in a daily stand-up is you say what you did yesterday to move your projects forward that you're working on for the sprint. You say what you plan to do today to move projects forward, and then you say if you're stuck with anything and need help moving it forward. Now that last part is really the whole reason for the stand-ups. If you've got some sort of blocking point that you can't get around, you need someone else's help on the team to be able to move forward with, then it's really convenient to do this. Meet once a day for 15 minutes. Everybody goes through their list, and if people are working very closely, if there's a lot of contingencies within the team, it's very good. If you've got people who are working sort of on their own individual projects and there's not a lot of crossover between them, then you may find that you don't need to do daily stand-ups. For us, our sprint planning meeting and our backlog grooming and retrospectives is enough for us to be able to keep in sync on a regular basis. And we keep in regular communication if we need anything else, but there's a good structured way to do it if you need that sort of structure. Here is probably one of my favorite parts, which is the team board. We keep a Trello board to do this. You can do it in Jira, you can do this in Asana, you can do this with a whiteboard with sticky notes, or really anything where you want to keep it. I find that Trello is pretty easy to do this with. A lot of integrations to plug into it. A lot of Chrome extensions that are particularly useful for some of these things. Fairly easy for people to learn. And if your team already has a Jira license, if they already have an Asana license, go ahead and use that. It's perfectly fine. I find this works for us. So this is a pretty basic Kanban board here. Elements that are within it are the backlog or the to-do list. Now basically the backlog is the list of the prioritized list of all of the things that you haven't started working on yet. Now this should always be prioritized so that the next thing that you pull from the list is the highest priority. You don't want to be searching through the list at any point and looking for the thing that's going to be the highest value thing to do. You want to just be able to look off the top, which is why you have the backlog grooming meeting. This one here, in progress or doing. These are the things that you're currently working on. Now in a Kanban environment, you wouldn't really be doing a sprint, so it wouldn't be what's going on that sprint. It would be more just the things that are happening at that time, and you would limit the work in progress. Sort of a nuanced way of doing it. It's really more of a simpler way to do it, but less structured for teams. So it's a good way to do it if you're an individual who wants to work this way and maybe you don't have a lot of other people collaborating with you on this. But basically this should show and answer the question for anyone who wants to know, what are you working on? And if you see there on this Trello board, I've got myself assigned to some of these cards, and you can quickly filter the board by just the things that you're assigned to. So if you're using Trello, for example, keyboard shortcut, just press Q at any point and it'll filter the board directly just for you. Really nifty trick for that. And the next one here is the done column. And this is obviously all the projects that you've completed that are done. Now, if you're using a definition of done like I described previously in one of the documents, you would want all of the cards that are in that category to be able to meet that definition before they get moved over into here. So this is actually what our current board looks like. It's an example of what our current board looks like. As you can see, there are a lot more columns in this board than there are in a simple Kanban board. So I'll explain some of the ones that we added, some of the ones that we found to be necessary to adapt to be able to work for a marketing team and for product marketing in general. One thing is requests to be prioritized. So as I was mentioning, as a product marketer, you get a lot of requests from a lot of different internal audiences to work on a lot of things. So this is a place to capture all of those requests and and I actually have a Google form that I use that I synced up to this with Zapier in order to get the request automatically added to this Trello board, so people can just go fill out that Google form and it'll add a new card on this Trello board for that. And then I go through there and make sure that it's got everything I need to meet that definition of ready before we add it to the backlog during the backlog grooming meeting. So that's the whole reason for this is really to keep out any of those cards from the backlog that aren't ready to go into the backlog, while providing a place to store all of those. And the next one that important to mention is the no column. So these are all of the projects that you've said no to. These are the ones that meet that definition of no that I was describing earlier. And it can be for several reasons. Now, what I like to do, what I find is the best practice here, is to make a comment on all of the cards describing the reason why you're not going to work on them. And it can be a lot of different things. It can be, again, not enough value for the amount of effort that you're putting into it. It can be that you didn't get enough commitment from the stakeholder. Whatever the reason, put a comment in there. And if you've got someone who originally requested it, like for example anyone who filled out that Google form that I was talking about, I'd send a note back to them and let them know that we're not going to be able to work on that. Now, if they either want to change their request, they want to provide additional commitment to be able to help with whatever it is, we can certainly reevaluate it as a request, but we would do that as moving it into the request to be prioritized and look at it again there and reassess what we're doing. The next one here is waiting for external dependency. And this one is basically what happens whenever you get stuck with a project. So it's a list of things that you've started, but you're waiting for someone or something external to the team before you can move them forward. So anytime that I've got something that's that's in my in-progress queue, and either I'm waiting for someone external to the team to respond to me about something, or I'm waiting on something else to happen, waiting on a piece of information from someone. If it's like a customer case study, for example, and I'm working with a customer and I haven't heard back from the customer yet, I'll move that into waiting on an external dependency, and I'll make a comment about why I'm waiting for it. And then after a while, you want to start, if something sits and you're waiting on external dependency for a really long time, you may end up moving it to your no column just to clean up that queue a bit. The other thing about the waiting on external dependency that I've found is if you do finally get that dependency resolved, I just leave it in there, move it up to the top, and wait for the next sprint planning meeting to move it back into the queue. Just because I probably picked up some other things to work on at the time, and I'll get back to it in the next sprint, basically. So next thing here, in progress, no work this sprint. This is basically the thing that we do whenever we start a project and for some reason or another we've decided we won't have time to work on it during the next sprint. We didn't complete it in the previous sprint. Could be due to shifting priorities. Maybe we had a new item come into the backlog that needed to be worked on, and we're not going to have time to work on that one at the time. Maybe it's a holiday week or someone's on vacation, so we're going to move those into in progress, no work this week. And it's just as sort of a secondary cue to show that there's been work that's been done on it. People can look at the status of it. It's not that it hasn't been started. It's that it's been started and hasn't met the definition of done yet, and there won't be anything that's done this week on it. Usually we'll go through that list first during our sprint planning so that we can pick up any items from there and make sure that they're more important than the items that are in the backlog that are coming through, so that we can get those done first before we start picking off new items from the backlog. Overhead column. And this one, I think, is extremely important to make that adaptation from a software development team to a marketing team in the way that we work. There are a ton of tasks that are done every day, that are done every week, that are repetitive, that are things that we don't particularly plan for. That pop up, that there are things like social media updates that happen every day, like responding to tweets or responding to comments in places, syndication programs that you're running on a regular basis that don't really have an end date in mind. It's not like something that you can get done. It's just something that you do on a regular basis, meetings that you're doing. And the real reason for this is to be able to show where you're spending your time. So it's important for you to know where you're spending your time. It's important for your managers to know where you're spending your time, because if you've got more and more things that keep getting added to your overhead, there are fewer things that you can work on during your regular sprint, or there are fewer things that you can do. So if, for example, Scrum teams typically measure their velocity. So if we were to look at what I was calling the value effort scoring that we're using for this, you can sort of see it. I use an extension called Scrum for Trello to be able to track that on these cards. So the first number there is the value, the second number is the effort. So either tracking on a monthly or week or sprintly basis, I suppose, what the velocity is that you have, and by velocity I mean number of the total effort score for the things that you've completed during that time, and the total value that you deliver during that time. If you're not properly tracking all of your overhead, it can appear that over time you may be dropping your velocity, and in reality what's actually happening is that you've taken on more overhead. You're attending more meetings, you're spending more time answering emails, or you've got more of these sort of repetitive processes that are happening on a regular basis. So whenever I calculate what the team has done over time, what I do is typically on a monthly basis, I'll have a done column, and I'll take all of the cards from the done column and I'll move it over to another board, and then I'll tack on the monthly overhead here, and that'll show me everything that the team's done that month. So scoring this in a value effort level for the month is just one way to keep track of it. You can obviously do it every sprint. That could take a lot of work. You could do it every quarter, a little bit easier to do. But tracking this, I found, is extremely important for marketing teams. So, to sum up, for those who didn't watch the entire presentation and just want to get the too long didn't watch, basically, Agile isn't about doing more things in less time with fewer resources. It's about doing the right things at the right times while treating people like people. Having an Agile mindset is more important than which tactics you use or which framework you follow. There are a lot of frameworks and tactics tagged as Agile. Remember, these require adaptation, even with different types of software development teams. So many will require adaptation to work for product marketing teams or marketing teams in general. Only use the tactics that are right for you, your team, and your organization. If something doesn't fit, don't do it. If you agree as a team that you aren't finding a particular tactic useful or just aren't doing it, stop doing it and forget about it. Don't stress about these things. Remember, if the most important thing about being Agile is having that mindset, Doing those three things I outlined, treating people as people, recognizing that you can't predict the future, and producing value on a regular basis and delivering that to your audience as what you need to be agile. The rest of it is all tactics. So if you have any questions, you can reach me at tim@productmarketing.management or connect with me on LinkedIn, linkedin.com/in/Timothy Hines. And I'm also coming out with a new blog and podcast launching soon, which is at productmarketing.management. So hope to see you there. Thanks.